Good morning. I'm Mark Tufnell. I'm Deputy President of the Country Land and Business Association, and I'm delighted to be joined by Lesley Griffiths, who's Minister for the Environment, Energy and Rural Affairs in the Welsh Government. And we're here to talk about the changes to the agricultural support system in Wales, and also to explore how our Rural Powerhouse campaign can fit in. And it includes, most importantly, the key element of promoting a sustainable and profitable farming sector. But before we start, I'd just like you to hear a little resume of Lesley's career. Lesley, you were brought up in North East Wales, and you've lived and worked in Wrexham all your adult life. You were elected to the National Assembly for Wales in May 2007, and since May 2016, you've had responsibility for rural affairs within all of your portfolios, and you were appointed to your current role in December 2018. So before we start the main part of the interview, I mean, we are in very challenging times for all of us. And I should just explain that this interview is taking place on the 5th of November, and it's being recorded, and we're releasing it on November the 23rd at the start of our Rural Powerhouse Week. We don't know today what the outcome of the Brexit discussions are going to be, nor do we know the result of the American elections. And we have a fire break in place in Wales, and England has just gone into lockdown Mark 2. So we are in very challenging times, but Lesley will do the discussion as if we are where we are today, and you might do some crystal ball gazing as we go forward. So if we could start with a number of the questions I'd like to cover in the next half an hour or so. Could you be very kind and give a brief overview to our CLA members about the change in policy away from direct payments to the new proposed agricultural system in Wales?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Mark. As you say, we're in very challenging times at the moment, and you know, alongside the COVID-19 pandemic, we also have a climate emergency. We have a biodiversity emergency. And we'll be leaving the European Union at the end of the year, as you said. So it's really important that we take the opportunity that's offered to us by leaving the European Union. Not an opportunity I would have preferred, but we now have the opportunity to have a tailored, bespoke agricultural policy made in Wales for Wales. So what I'm proposing is a new system of agricultural support in Wales on the principles of sustainable land management. So we went out to consultation last year. I've not long published the responses, and I'll be bringing forward a draft paper by the end of this calendar year. We are known in Wales for our very high quality food that's produced in a very sustainable way, and our Welsh farmers will need to continue to do that. I also think they bring forward many environmental outcomes for which at the moment they're not rewarded for. So it's important that those environmental outcomes are rewarded. That will be part of the bespoke scheme also. They contribute so much to the health and well-being of our nation, and they create a sustainable and resilient agricultural sector that needs to be there not just now, but obviously for our future generations, and fits in with our Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. So that's basically what we're proposing within the new scheme.
And just to follow on from that, you've set out the direction of travel, and you've had 2 consultation papers on it, and you launched one of them on one of our members' farms. And we've been very much involved as an organisation in giving our thoughts towards sustainable farming and land management. But how do you think in practice the average farmer and land manager is going to cope, particularly where they're already providing these environmental benefits? And do you think that they're ready for this fundamental change?
So I've been very fortunate in this portfolio to have great collaboration and partnership working with stakeholders. And of course, As you say, you and your members have contributed to those consultations. Will they be? I think they're prepared, because I think everybody recognises you can't just keep doing the same things. I don't think you can even keep doing the same things differently. You have to do different things. So as I said in my earlier answer, many farmers are producing, well, the majority of farmers are producing environmental outcomes now for which they're not being rewarded. So, I think they recognise that that is the way forward if we're going to respond to the climate emergency. So, the COVID pandemic sort of hit us very suddenly, whereas the climate emergency has perhaps been a gradual process of people recognising that we are currently in the middle of a climate emergency. You only have to see the unprecedented flooding we've had this year to make us realise that. So I think people recognise we've got to do something different. So what the white paper will do is set out our legislative proposals for the bespoke, tailored agricultural bill that I referred to earlier, which will come in the Sixth Senedd. What we need to do is really create a system that works for Wales, for our farmers, for our land managers, for our rural communities, for the wider supply chain, and of course for the industry. So I think people do recognise what's coming, but of course there's still a lot of work to do to work up all the proposals much more formally.
Yes, so if I think about the legislation behind this, within England we have the agriculture bill, and at the moment, 5th of November, it's gone from the House of Commons back to the House of Lords, and it's part of this ping pong process. And you mentioned your white paper, and the expectation, as far as I understand it, is that you'd have an agriculture bill in Wales after the Senedd in probably May of next year. But what do you think the differences will be between the Welsh and the English systems? And are you able to learn from, if you like, the discussions that have gone on in England over some of the difficulties that we've been seeing in Westminster with the way the legislative process has gone?
So, of course, you always want to learn lessons, and I've been obviously involved in conversations with the Secretary of State for DEFRA and with my counterparts in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And, there's been lots of noise around, are you going to have 4 very different policies, etc.? Well, that's called devolution, and it's up to each country to decide what's best for their farmers and for the agricultural sector. So, there could be differences. I actually think probably at the end of the day, there won't be massive differences, but I think there will be subtle differences, and certainly depending on which way the UK government go, whether they perhaps will be a little bit bigger than we thought. But, ultimately for me, it's about protecting those environmental standards. It's about protecting those animal health and welfare standards. Lots of concerns as we leave the European around that. I made it very clear that the powers I've taken in the UK agricultural bill will be temporary until we have our own bill and therefore act. I have to make sure that farmers are paid, and so therefore I needed those temporary powers as we left the European Union. But obviously we have discussions about our different policies, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's for each government to decide, and each minister, what's best for their own country.
Yes, of course, and devolution is key to where agriculture sits. At the moment, there's the internal markets bill being discussed, and also we have to look at the cross-border farms, and I think there are about 600 cross-border farms across the 3 nations. I think from our members' point of view, the plea would be just to try to have a simple system that the farmer and the land manager can understand and deal with and cope with. And I know we've already had some discussions with officials from your government and also the other governments. But I think that's a plea to make it simple, and a message that's come from our members.
Yeah, I think, as I say, that there will be differences. I don't think there'll be huge, but there clearly will be differences. I think what's really important is to have a joined up approach across the country. So if you think about food security, for instance, That's done on a UK level. So, you know, there has to be a joined up approach, but we have agreed a non-legislative framework for UK collaboration, coordination and cooperation on agricultural support. So there is that mechanism there. And of course, as somebody who represents a border constituency, any policy of any description that comes before me, I always think of it through that lens.
So as you mentioned, there are great risks from leaving a system that people have known for many years. So what do you think the opportunities are as we go forward in this transitional period?
Yes, I think you're right. People in general don't like change, do they? And you know, they quite like things to remain the same. But as I say, I do think we have to do things different. We are in very challenging and uncertain times, so we certainly do have to look for the opportunities as well as the many challenges that are presented to us. I think if you speak to people honestly, they will tell you that the Common Agricultural Policy hasn't done, you know, hasn't been the greatest thing, you know, that hasn't made our farms, some of our farms perhaps as resilient as we would want them to be, as competitive as we would want them to be. So I think what we want to do, and certainly what I want to do, is safeguard that current generation of farmers, ensure that farming continues to be viable for future generations, make sure we protect our rural communities. I mean, clearly there are lots of challenges, as I say, from all the variety of, you know, the climate emergency, the biodiversity emergency, and of course leaving the European Union and now the pandemic as well. And one thing I've been lobbied very hard on is protecting family farms and keeping the Welsh language safe, because clearly the agricultural sector is probably the main user of the Welsh language of all sectors here in Wales. And so I think, you know, we need to make sure we protect that. I think there's also an opportunity to get greater recognition for our Welsh food and drink. I think we've done a very good job promoting Welsh food and drink, but I think there are, you know, our sustainability credentials, for instance, I don't think they're recognised in the way that they should be. You know, some of our red meat is the most sustainably produced in the world. So, I would like to see that as an opportunity, particularly with future trading arrangements. We don't know what they're going to be at the moment. So we need to make sure that we're protected as much as we can be, but also able to grasp those opportunities.
Yes, I mean, as you say, Welsh lamb is a brand that's known the world over, and we'll come on a little bit later to this issue of trade. But just to finish on this transition from the current scheme, where we have Tir Goffel and we have basic payment, and we move forward to a scheme I think you're calling sustainable farming and sustainable land management. A lot of farmers and land managers providing lots of great food and also a lot of environmental goods. What measures are the Welsh Government proposing to put in place to make sure that those businesses are still going and that they haven't collapsed in that transition period through lack of support? And what do you feel, what would be the time scale you would put on that?
So we understand that obviously farmers will need to adapt to the new scheme. So we've been very clear that we won't move to a new scheme until everything's in place and everybody absolutely understands what's required for them. So there'll be a multi-year transitional period. You know, just won't happen overnight. One of the things I learned very early in this job from talking to, you know, particularly New Zealand, that did have that cliff edge where they stopped basic payment, and they were telling me, you know, how many small farms were lost, how, you know, they all became very large farms. They lost that feeling of community that I just referred to as being so important. So as I say, as we consider the impact on us, because we don't know what the impact will be as they leave the European Union. So we've said very clearly we won't make any changes until we can demonstrate a new system is absolutely adequately designed. For me, it should be much simpler than the current system. If we make it more complex, I think we will have failed. So it's really important that we make it as unbureaucratic as possible. I think we will have carried out a lot of impact assessments on a variety of levels. All that information needs to be hand, and we need to know that administratively it is absolutely practical to deliver that.
Well, that's really encouraging. If I think now about the other transition, because I've always thought there are two big transitions in agriculture, the transition from the support packages that are available, and then the transition in trade and the trade arrangements. And we have this whole issue of the Brexit trade negotiations, and at the moment, certainly at the time of this recording, it's still really uncertain. I know your department put out a very useful paper on the three scenarios that could fall to the sector, and one particular area that would be really adversely hit would be the Welsh sheep sector. And I just wondered whether you had in mind a particular support package or a compensation package that might be available to your farmers to cover that in the eventuality that there is a no deal.
Yes, so the sheep sector we know would be particularly vulnerable, as you say. Around 35% of Welsh lamb is currently exported, of which 95% is destined for the European Union, you know, our biggest neighbour and our biggest market. So we learned very early that that was a particularly vulnerable sector. So last year, when a no deal was looming very, very high, we got together again across the UK to ensure that we had a sheep sector scheme, for want of a better word. So the last couple of months, obviously that scheme has now been dusted off. We're looking at bringing that forward. We've made it very clear that we would expect the UK government to fund it. So those negotiations are back on now. But the scheme was more or less brought together last year and we all obviously fed into that. But yes, that is an area that is particularly vulnerable.
And have you felt an understanding of that with the Secretary of State, George Eustace? Has he understood the problem, which is a particularly Welsh problem? I mean, it would impact on other areas within England and Scotland, but it's particularly important in Wales. Has he grasped the nettle, do you feel?
Yes, absolutely. You know, I've made sure I meet regularly with the Secretary of State and, as I say, my counterparts from Scotland and Northern Ireland. We met last Monday. I think we're meeting again a week on Monday. We don't normally meet as often as that, but clearly this is something that we've been discussing now, as I say, for probably about 15, 16 months. So yes, I think he absolutely does understand that. And obviously officials work very closely on this as well. So we're monitoring developments very slowly, very carefully, sorry, and we need to ensure that sheep sector, if it is particularly vulnerable and if it is a no deal Brexit, then we have to make sure we support them.
Well, I think our members will be particularly hard
cut that
to
bit,
hear that,
sorry.
Actually. Well, it's, you know, you're allowed to have a cough. But Lesley, no, I think our members will be particularly heartened to hear that, because clarity is really what we need. And certainly within a lot of the noises and messages that have been coming out of DEFRA, for example, they're very clear about how basic payment will be cut. They're not really quite so clear about how sustainable farming incentive will be brought in. And it's clarity that businesses need at times of uncertainty. So looking forward, what would you like to achieve in your ministerial role? So
for me, I think, strangely enough, I was asked at another conference this morning, you know, what do I think my achievements have been? So for me, being able to go out and sell Welsh food and farming to the world has been, you know, such a privilege. And I think the fact that, you know, we had a food and drink action plan where we wanted to grow the industry by 30% to £7 billion by the end of 2020. And we achieved that a year early. And that's because we have such high standards of food and drink here in Wales. And, you know, to be able to take that out to the world has been a massive privilege. So I would like to carry that on. So this summer we should have gone ahead with the next action plan, but because of COVID, we haven't been able to do that. And certainly talking to our farmers, you know, they are so proud of the produce they bring forward. For me, that it's been an easy sell, if you like. You're able, you know, when you say you're from Wales, as you say, Welsh lamb is instantly recognised, but our beef as well. We have so many foods that have protected names. So, you know, Caerphilly cheese, your Hallam on salt, you know, we're very, very fortunate in Wales to have so many fantastic produce. So that's been, I think, something that I've really, really enjoyed and been able to do. But I suppose for me now, protecting the agricultural sector and our rural communities in this way is very important, because, you know, I can't imagine a time when we won't need to support the agricultural sector. So I don't actually like the word subsidy. I think it's support. And again, I don't think the Welsh public perhaps recognise the effort and love, for want of a better word. I think, you know, being a farmer is a real vocation. And, you know, I've stood back in amazement and watched people work the land in a way that, because, you know, when you're from an urban area, perhaps you don't recognise that. And I think one opportunity from the pandemic was that people were much more keen to buy locally. And people had, I think, started to become more interested in the provenance of the food and where it was from and how it's produced. But I think that's a massive selling point for us. So I would like to really continue with that too.
Well, I focused on the sheep sector in particular, but I mustn't forget, of course, in your paper, you highlighted the impact on the beef, pigs, poultry, milk and dairy, wheat and barley. And I think you highlight the fact that agriculture and the rural economy is the bedrock, really. And the point of our Rural Powerhouse campaign was to say that there's a whole amount of gross value added that could be unleashed, so that you could, if you improve on the overall productivity levels, you could create a whole load of additional gross value added, which would really boost and help the whole economy and help us all as we come out of this very difficult time. So if I close by asking you to cast your mind even further to 2030 and where you think the industry will be in 2030, and your scheme will have come in, the scheme in England will have come in, and hopefully the trade arrangements will have sorted themselves out. Where do you think, Lesley, will be in 2030? So
my hope is that the sector will be even more resilient and competitive than it is now. So, you know, we've worked very closely since the referendum and obviously this transition period now to make sure our agricultural sector is as robust and resilient as possible. So I would hope we're able to go from strength to strength. I think it's really important that we do get a trade deal that's fair. And as I said, you know, why would we not want to trade with our closest neighbour, 500 million people? Why would we not want to do that? So that frictionless trade that we've known for so long, let's hope that we have something very similar and that the sector can continue to thrive. I would love more people to know the story of Welsh food and drink and want to buy it because of the quality of it and because of the environmental standards that we have and because of our animal health and welfare standards. So for me, you know, really protecting those standards is so important now to make sure that that's where we will be in another decade's time.
Well, Lesley, Minister, thank you very much indeed for all your time this morning. You've given a fascinating review of where we are now and where you hope that we will go. And I share your hopes, and I'm sure together we can work for the greater benefit of those in the rural countryside. And our members, CLA members who are farmers and land managers, will come away from this, I hope, with an uplift in their expectations. And I look forward to seeing the programme that you've set out. So, Lesley, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to your members for all their help as well.